2 Samuel chapter 17. And the first thing that we find is we find somebody dealing with, I guess for lack of a better term, somebody dealing with bitterness. And it has turned someone who normally, at least from what we know about them, was not a killer, and yet has turned them into a killer. And let me just read to you, chapter 17, 2 Samuel, verse 1, Ahithophel. Now, let me just reset the stage for you. We are in the portion of David's life after his sin with Bathsheba. We have already had an incident where one of his sons, his oldest son in fact, violated his sister, and then 2 years later he was killed by her brother. And then Absalom, the son who did the killing, had fled. He was gone for 3 years. And then he did come back. Joab intervened and got him back. And then he stayed here in Israel, there in Jerusalem, for 2 years without even seeing his dad. All that while, bitterness was building in his heart. And he came back, and then he began to win the hearts of the people of Israel and convince them that they didn't want an old and infirm king. They wanted a new young king. And he won their hearts and kind of staged a rebellion. And he even got the chief counselor for King David on board, and this name was Ahithophel. Ahithophel, we learn, is a guy, we learned this just at the end of the last chapter, that his advice was like hearing from God. It says in verse 23 of chapter 16, "In those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God." That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. And so Ahithophel, David and his loyal people have fled from Jerusalem because David didn't want the city to be destroyed. He loved the city, and he was hoping that he could preserve the city. And he was also, I think, hoping that if he got out into the countryside, he could win the support of the people, which in fact you will see tonight does actually happen. And he begins to rally some supporters around him. But now Absalom has come into the city of Jerusalem, and Ahithophel says to Absalom, what you need to do to make sure this thing really goes your way is take these 10 concubines, take them up on the roof of the palace, and sleep with them. And then everybody will know that things can never be patched up between you and your dad. That offense, in and of itself, was an offense worthy of death on the part of Absalom. The fact that he was inciting and had incited a rebellion was also cause for death, according to the way they did things in Israel. And so 2 times at least now, Absalom has already done things that are deserving of death. And then he's going to try to actually kill David, kill the king. And that again, he's killed Amnon, which makes him again worthy of death. And so he's done a lot of stuff here. And yet you're going to find when David comes right down to it, David is really reluctant to let anything happen to his son. So as we're in this situation now, Absalom is in the palace. He has done what Ahithophel has advised. And so now Ahithophel says to Absalom, here's what I want to do. I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed. And look at this. The plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. Important point here is that Ahithophel is so filled with bitterness. You'll remember I pointed out to you that Ahithophel is in fact the grandfather of Bathsheba. And he has been holding this thing in his heart, this bitterness, this anger toward David because of David's conduct toward Uriah, who was an honorable man, and in fact an honorable man who was more honorable when he was drunk than David was when he was sober. And so Ahithophel has been hanging on to this bitterness, And David, it doesn't seem that he reached out to the other family members. He didn't reach out to one who there's a guy who shows up who may have been Bathsheba's brother. And then definitely to her dad and to her grandfather, Ahithophel, there's still bitterness there. And this bitterness has taken a man who gives godly, wise counsel and has turned him into a murderer. As you look at this statement that he gives in verse 1 of chapter 17, I think it's in the, it may be in the King James, but there's an indication in the text that what Ahithophel is saying is this: here's what I will do. I will take the 12,000 men, I will go after the king, and I will strike down David and David only, and then all the people will be brought back to you. So the man who was a counselor has allowed this bitterness to so grip him that he is turned into a murderer. Absalom has allowed his bitterness toward his dad to grow to a point that he is willing to be a murderer. And so there's a very important point there, and I think that's just simply this: you need to deal with any bitterness that you might have, because if you don't, it can change you, and it can change you in a bad way. It made Ahithophel a murderer. It made Absalom into a very proud, killer. You've got to be really careful about that. And then another thing here, it says that the plan sounded good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. Sometimes you talk about bitterness, and especially in a church setting, and people say, not me, I'm not bitter. Look at the people you're hanging with. If the people you're hanging out with are bitter, you're probably bitter. And you may not want to admit it, but if the people you're hanging out with, by choice, sometimes, we have family members, and you may not have a choice whether you're going to be around them or not. But other times, if it's somebody you choose to be hanging around with, these guys chose to be with Absalom because they likewise were feeling some bitterness toward David. Some of the stuff we don't see in the scripture is, as David was aging, there was all this seeking of God and finding out what God wanted up to the point of chapter 11 when he committed sin with Bathsheba. And then after that, it's like things begin to go downhill. David still loves God. David still worships God. But there seemed to be some indication that he was not as diligent as he had been previously, which is allowing some of this discontent to be bred among the people. And so these guys that are hanging with Absalom, they're bitter. Ahithophel, he's finding himself right in the same company. You've all heard that old saying that says, misery loves company. Well, bitterness loves company. And bitterness loves to be around other people that are bitter. Bitterness doesn't like to be around somebody who says, I can't stand the way this guy acts. And somebody says, what? What's wrong? What's wrong with you? And they try to correct you. Bitterness doesn't want to be around it. They want to get away. These guys were all content hanging out with each other. So if the people you're hanging with are bitter, be careful, because it might be an indication that you yourself are bitter. And so now as we look at this, Absalom says, okay, but summon also Hushai the Archite. Now remember, Hushai was also a very good friend of David and an advisor. He was not held with the esteem that Ahithophel had, but he was an esteemed counselor. He had gone back to the city of Jerusalem, and he had said to Absalom, long live the king. As I serve the Father, I will serve you. I'm going to serve God's anointed. And so Hushai was actually a plant by David. David may have been getting older, but David still was cunning. David was still battle-wise, and he knew it would be a good thing to have somebody in the palace that could speak up for him. And so they said, okay, summon Hushai. Now, it's part of the providence of God that Absalom believed him, and that Absalom allowed Hushai to come into his presence and trusted him. And it's also providential that Absalom here says, summon Hushai. We need to hear what he has to say. So Hushai comes in. And I can imagine as Hushai is walking in, he's thinking to himself, he sees Absalom. Absalom is a usurper. Absalom is a proud, arrogant, overbearing, self-focused person who's trying to take the kingdom for himself. You ever been around people where you just have to kind of bite your tongue before you say something you shouldn't say? And I can imagine Hushai feeling that, but just trusting God to come across in a way that says he's relaxed, he's comfortable, and he's giving genuine advice. And so it says when Hushai came, Absalom says, hey, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Now, here's the thing, folks. Ahithophel's advice was right. Ahithophel's advice was the only way that David would have been taken out. And Ahithophel knows that. So now they turn to Hushai, and because God is providentially protecting David, even though David's bearing the consequences of his sins, God is still providentially protecting him. And so he says, well, actually, Ahithophel's advice is not good. And what amazes me about this advice is not only does Hushai come across with this in a way that's convincing, but he also uses solid logic that convinced them. Look what he says. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father's an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. You might attack the troops, and he's not even there. He's going to be spending the night somewhere else. And if he happens to attack you first, and anybody that hears about it is going to hear, there's a slaughter. And then the reputation of David and his men is going to take over, and your cause is lost. Now, the truth of the matter, from what we can pull together, is that this may have been kind of calling on and casting David in a past light. Absalom has not had a whole lot of contact with his dad, and he doesn't know, and it may be very well, and in fact the point is later that David is told by his men, you're not going out to battle with us. And the reason for that was because David was starting to get a little weaker. He's starting to show his age. And so he's painting a picture that calls to mind all of the history, all of the legend that was around David. And it was enough that not only did Absalom believe it, but the men that were with him, they also believed. And he says that, if this happens, even the bravest soldier whose heart's like the heart of a lion is going to melt with fear, because all Israel knows, your father is a fighter, and those with him are brave. All of this is true. It may not have actually come about that way, because if they had actually attacked, David could probably have been taken out. So he says, here's what I advise. He said, I think you need to go from the north all the way to the south, and you need to gather the whole army of Israel. The whole army. And as you get the whole army together, he says, and I think you, Absalom, need to lead the charge. Now, think about this for a moment. One of the reasons that David was so well accepted as king was that David was a mighty warrior. It was David that took out Goliath. It was David that was successful against the Philistines. It was David who led the men on all of their battles and brought home victory after victory after victory, and then he stepped into the kingship. And what Hushai is appealing to now, he's appealing to Absalom's vanity. He's also appealing to what Absalom knows about how his dad came to the throne. And he's saying, you need to lead. And what he's not saying is, you don't need Ahithophel to do this. You need to do this. You need to lead all of Israel. And then if he takes refuge in a city somewhere, why, we'll throw ropes over the side with large hooks on them, and we'll just pull those walls down, and we'll have enough manpower that we can just overwhelm him wherever he is, and we'll take out all of these men that are supporting your dad. Well, he built it up in such a way, and God's hand was in this, that they said, you know what, the advice of Hushai is better than that of Ahithophel. But look at the last half of that verse. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Now, remember, David has a notification system. They couldn't, Hushai couldn't slip into a side room and pull out his cell phone and call David and say, David, you got to get to cover because I don't know which of these planes they're going to take and they might be coming after you. He couldn't do that because he didn't have cell phones. They didn't even have regular phones. They didn't even have tin cans with rope on them that you could tap it and get somebody's attention. They had to send people. And so they had a plan in place. And so he went to Zadok and Abiathar, who were the priests, and he said to them, hey, this is what's happening. You need to get word to David. And so they got word to a servant girl. And the servant girl went to where their two sons were, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, and they gave them the message. Well, one of Absalom's men saw those two. I don't know how he put it together, because it sounds to me like they did a really good job of keeping it concealed from Absalom. But somebody came back and said, Absalom, I saw these two guys and they're heading out. They might be taking a message to King David. And that's in verse, verse 16 there? No, 18. Young man saw them and told Absalom. And so they actually ended up in the house of a guy, a man located in Bahurim. And the guy had a well in his courtyard. Now, this was most likely an empty well. Some of the richer, more well-to-do people would have cisterns on their properties where they could let the rainfall come and it would build up these cisterns and they would have drinking water right on hand. And again, you got to remember, back in this day and time, they couldn't turn the faucet on and get the water because they had to rely on wells, they had to rely on aqueducts and cisterns like this. So the two guys climbed down in the cistern and they laid some grain out over a covering, and nobody was the wiser. They came, searched the house. The lady did tell them a lie. She said that they crossed over the brook. And so they went and they searched. And again, this was the hand of God. So the two guys climb out and they go and they inform David. Now, the net result of the advice that Hushai gave was this. It gave time to David to stabilize. And it gave time for David to prepare and to get ready for what was about to happen. And so it doesn't tell us how long, but one thing that's really, really important here is in verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and he set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then he committed suicide. Now, when you think about this, the first thing that comes to my mind is, what a spoiled baby. They didn't follow his advice, so he went and he hung himself. Wasn't that at all. Ahithophel was a very clear-minded, clear thinker. And Ahithophel knew that the only way that King David was going to be taken out of the way was the plan he suggested. He also knew that the plan that Hushai had suggested was not going to result in David's death. And if David didn't die, guess who was going to die? Ahithophel. And Ahithophel knew that. And he knew he would have no mercy, and he knew that David was going to come out of this, and he knew that David would come after him. And so he went home, he put everything in order, and then he hung himself. Because he wanted to take his own life rather than having David take his life. And David would have. David would have done that. So now, finally, David has crossed over, they crossed the Jordan, and all of his people went with him. And I think there's a little indication of the number of people that were with David. If you look back up at verse 22, it says, David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one who was left had not crossed the Jordan. Did you catch that? By daybreak? They probably received the word that evening and began crossing. There may have been as many as 10 to 15,000 people with David at this point. And I'll show you why I think that in just a couple of minutes. So Absalom finally, and it took a while, It might have been 3 days, it might have been 10 days. We're not really sure. But he sent from the north to the south, gathered an army. He chose Amasa as the head of the army. Amasa was from the tribe of Judah. And Amasa would have been a cousin to Absalom. And in fact, Amasa was the son of a lady named Abigail. Abigail was sister to a woman named Zeruiah. And Abigail and Zeruiah were siblings with David. So this was David's sister's sons. Joab was Zeruiah's son, and he was nephew to David, commander of David's army. Abishai also, Asahel, who died before, they were all David's nephews. Now Amasa, who's leading the charge, and he's standing at Absalom's side, he's also one of David's nephews, and he's first cousin to Absalom. And so, an interesting note here, it says that Amasa was the son of Jether, an Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash. Wait a minute. Daughter of Nahash? I thought she was the daughter of Jesse. Well, the commentators were there said one of two things is possible here. Either Nahash is another name for Jesse, or Nahash may have been the name of Jesse's wife. And I kind of lean toward that. It seems to be it was a name that was used a good bit back in that time. Well, now David's on the other side now. Now remember, Jerusalem, if you were looking at a map here behind me, and at the center of the cross was the Jordan River. On the left-hand side, about where the crossbeam comes, well, a little below the crossbeam, is where Jerusalem was located. David then crossed to the other side, to the area where the Reubenites and Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh had been given their territory, which was on the east side of the Jordan River. And so that's where David is at this point. And there are three guys that come, and they come to help David. Now, you remember I mentioned to you that I thought that one of the reasons why David left the palace and left Jerusalem was he thought maybe he could drum up support from the people. And that, in fact, is happening. And so what's happening here now is we've got a guy by the name of Shobi, who is the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites. Now, that's interesting. Shobi, son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites. Well, there was another son named Hanan. Do you remember the incident that I told you about a couple of weeks ago where the father Nahash had died and Hanan had taken over? David sent his ambassadors to give his condolences. And when they got there, the young men around Hanan said, oh, these guys came to spy it out. And so they cut the guys' robes off and left their bottoms bare, and they cut half their beards off and sent them away. Well, David then attacked, and that guy Hanan got killed. And it's very likely that this guy Shobi was the brother of Hanan, and that he had not been in favor of what Hanan had done. And for that reason, David may very well have actually put him in charge of the people of Ammon after David had conquered. And so that's where this guy Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah, the Ammonites, comes from. So he would have been a rich man. And then we've got Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lo-debar, and Barzillai, the Gileadite. All three of these guys are very, very rich men. And you'll see they bring things like wheat and barley, flour, roasted grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds. That was interesting, honey and curds. When I was reading that and reading about it in the commentary, that's actually some kind of a beverage. I was thinking, you know what I was thinking? I was thinking cottage cheese and honey. But from what they say, it was actually some kind of a very, very flavorful drink. And this would have all been very refreshing. And the bedding, of course, you know, when you got a whole bunch of people, where are they going to sleep? And so they've got all this stuff, and they brought all these provisions. And they said the people certainly have become exhausted and hungry and thirsty. There's a huge group of people there. So, jumping now over into chapter 18. David gets all the men together that are with him, and here's a couple of indicators of the size of the group. He appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. There had to be at least 2,000, and at least 3 because they named 3 of them. And it may be that these 3 that are named are a third of the force, and they would have been commanders of the commanders of thousands. David then sends his troops out, a third of them under Joab, a third under Abishai, and then a third under Ittai the Gittite. Remember, that was the guy that we thought may have been the son of Achish, the king of the Philistines, who had been exiled because of his support of David, had come with 600 of his own men. And so the king's telling the troops, listen, I'm going to go out with you. And the men said, you're not going to go out. Because if we end up fleeing, we end up running, they don't care about us. Even if half of us die, they're not going to care. You are worth 10,000 of us. Now, it's possible that that's simply a way of saying that David was of tremendous worth. Remember back when we talked about Saul has slain his thousands, David has slain his tens of thousands, that was an indication of slaying a man who was a mighty man of valor and a mighty man of power. It could be that, but there's another translation there that says even if half of us die, they won't care. And it's actually a footnote. It says, for now there are 10,000 like us, but there's only one of you. So it's very likely this group of supporters of David had grown to a point where there was at least 10,000. You ready to stop that?
Not quite there.
Go ahead, you can do it.